You know, Fire Emblem is basically fancy chess, ain't it? Yeah, you've got pawns that die a little too easily, and then you become emotionally attached to, and want to get them romantically involved with other pawns so you can squeeze out some babies. I mean, that's how I play chess, I don't know about you. Fire Emblem has given us everything from permadeath heartbreak to anime melodrama over the past 30 years, and more than 20 games plus remakes, and I really should rank all of these, shouldn't I? This is where I would say that I won't be talking about games that never made it out of Japan, but to do so with Fire Emblem would be to eliminate half of the franchise. So just this once, we're talking about all of it. All the exclusives, all the remakes, everything ranked from worst to best. And there's really only one game that we have to go to first. If we need to start with the absolute worst of Fire Emblem, then it would be a crime if I didn't begin with Fire Emblem Heroes. I bought into this game, both figuratively and literally, thanks to its heavy gacha components, and being able to summon and use basically every Fire Emblem character ever made is pretty much the last good thing about Heroes. The story is nanometer thin, the battles are painfully repetitive, and the amount of power creep here is honestly insane. If you're not pouring money into this game every month, you will be left behind by an ever-changing metagame. It is a flimsy shadow of what Fire Emblem is. At least Fire Emblem Warriors had the good grace to be obviously different and to not mess around with fancified gambling. Warriors is singing off the same hymn sheet that brought The Legend of Zelda and Dynasty Warriors together, and sure enough, it's a Musou spin-off that streamlines all the strategy and tactical battling for some easily digestible hacking and slashing. It's nothing offensive, but it is obviously shallow and repetitive. Honestly, it's not trying to be anything incredible, and I respect it for that. Sometimes you need something really simple to keep you busy for a while. Tokyo Mirage Sessions is really weird. I was debating whether or not to include it, since the modern Tokyo setting and turn-based combat and idols set it quite far apart from what you'd expect from Fire Emblem. But you do have characters like Chrom and Tharja turning up as mirages, so it is technically a crossover. It is a fun game, but ultimately it is as far removed from traditional Fire Emblem as you'd reasonably expect to go. I do like weird crossovers though, so this does scratch that particular itch, but in a video about Fire Emblem games, I can't speak too highly on the Fire Emblem part of this game because it's small. You should play it, but not for the Fire Emblem stuff in particular. And after all those spin-offs, we should stumble across a mainline game any minute now. Oh shit, there it is! Pound for pound, I think you'd have to say that the very first Fire Emblem is the weakest traditional game in the franchise, and that is absolutely fine. I mean, in a perfect world it should be, right? It should be this game that introduces a bunch of mechanics that go on to define Fire Emblem as a series, but over time, future games have moved past it and built upon these foundations. I mean, you can play it nowadays, but it is very bare bones and missing a ton of the refinement that has come since, but hey, it brought in the weapon triangle and permadeath, so it's good stuff. And again, logically, the next worst game after the first one should be the second one, right? So that would be Fire Emblem Gaiden, yeah? And yeah, it is, but it is so much more complicated than that. If you're familiar with your naming conventions, you'll know that Gaiden means side story, which is often a cool thing that a lot of manga and animes do. Here's a question though, why do this for the second game in a new franchise? I don't really know, but rather than consolidating existing features, Gaiden has these huge empty maps where nothing happens, and all these dungeon areas so you can do a bunch of pointless grinding, and then there's a whole raft of balancing issues. It's like a tactical RPG mixed in with a lot of traditional elements, but without any care for how they mesh together, because believe me, it's like oil and water sometimes. Maybe have fewer ideas next time? I promise you that this ranking isn't just the weird spin-offs followed by every Fire Emblem in release order, but that's just kinda how it's worked out at this point in time. Mystery of the Emblem is at least a step back in the right direction for traditional Fire Emblem. Narratively, it's a weird game, since it's split into one half that is essentially a remake of Fire Emblem 1, and then the second half is actual new content, and I don't know, it kinda works for me. There have been just enough improvements to justify going around again, and that sequel story thing is actually really engaging. It is a Fire Emblem game released in the mid-90s though, and mechanically it's a rough ride these days. At least they found their way back to a kind of game that works though. I have good news! Genealogy of the Holy War is way too good to be this far down a rankings video, so we've broken this weird streak we had going. Instead we have Shadow Dragon, the DS remake of Fire Emblem 1, which is left in the tricky position of deciding what stuff to fix and how much of this prehistoric game should be retained. The best improvements are the graphics and the all-new support conversations, but you've still got slow combat, simplistic maps, and a fairly boring story, so it does feel like a wasted opportunity. Why not do more? Are we still keeping up with all these remakes? Okay, so New Mystery of the Emblem is a remake of Mystery of the Emblem, which is, of course, like a soft remake of the first Fire Emblem game, so we're talking about the coveted double remake. This one's pretty good though, since it mainly remakes the new second half from Mystery of the Emblem, and does so while adding in an avatar character for the first time in Fire Emblem history. Chris does end up overshadowing Marth a bit, which unbalances the story a lot, but hey, at least we've got casual mode for the first time, so you haven't got to worry about permadeath. It's got some big ideas, but some of them are really dumb. And speaking of dumb, we have Fire Emblem Fates Revelation. Yes, we're splitting them up, because to combine Revelation with actually good games would be a travesty for this video, and I need to spend some time on this one specifically. Revelation was advertised as the true path of Fates, where you reject both families and end up joining Smash. Wait, hang on. Where you do your own thing and uncover the secret story behind everything. It feels even more fanficky than standard modern Fire Emblem, and it has to fill its runtime with exposition since there's so much ground to cover, and then by the time the big hitting units join in, it's far too late for there to be any kind of decent game balance. It's a mess, and only this high because it's a bad version of a pretty great game. And the music is kinda tasty, not gonna lie. The Binding Blade is where Roy came out swinging, and also where Fire Emblem started to forge a path for itself on the GBA, a console that it would end up making some real nice games for. Binding Blade suffers a little bit from huge empty maps with very little in them, so you spend half the battle moving all your units into place, and the other half working through all the reinforcements they send your way. Also, I don't care much for the story since Roy is a cool character, but doesn't really have much to do for most of it. It's an okay game, but it's lacking the refinement that future GBA games would go through. Give it time, I guess. It's been a long while since I talked about Thracia 776, and I still haven't worked out how to say it properly. Fire Emblem often gets a reputation for being challenging, and if you look at it, Thracia 776 is pretty much the hardest one in the series. It practically invents new mechanics to fuck with you, and the Fog of War maps have ambushes and death traps hiding around every corner, so yeah, kinda challenging stuff. It's a seriously stressful game that kind of veers into almost like a survival game at times, and if you can get on board with all of this, it can be a really unique and enjoyable experience. If you can't, it can often feel too punishing. Worth trying if new games feel too easy though, and you fancy wearing your big boy pants. Given where Fire Emblem is these days, you'd imagine the most recent game would be bumping elbows with the very best of them, and yet Fire Emblem Engage is one of the most disappointing games in the whole franchise. On one hand, it's got some damn fine polished gameplay, and even with how solid the gameplay generally is in this franchise, Engage might just have the best of the lot. The problem is a big one though, and that's the stories and the characters, which are fumbled so badly that it kinda sours the whole experience for me. Fire Emblem has tackled so many mature themes in the past and has gotten really dark, but Engage feels like a cartoon where nothing happens to a cast of nobodies that I don't care about. Get the gameplay team to sort this out right now. My ticket into this franchise was thanks to the Nintendo Ambassador program on the 3DS, which gave me easy access to Fire Emblem The Sacred Stones. Turns out this was effectively the perfect way to hop on board because Sacred Stones is exceptionally user-friendly. You got branching paths and branching classes, so you got loads of freedom with how you play this game, but it also has optional fights to help with grinding that ultimately ends up breaking the difficulty and leaves the Sacred Stone feeling way too easy overall. It is incredibly approachable though, and a game you can play and enjoy today with absolutely zero understanding of how this series works. It'll teach you some way, somehow. From one of the easier Fire Emblem games, we now have a game that was often described as overwhelming when it came out. Radiant Dawn is seriously ambitious, and its decision to tell this gigantic story across 4 acts, and with such a massive cast of characters, means that it is hard work keeping all of your units at an appropriate level, and also alive, of course. There's a lot of Radiant Dawn that works really well, and it can be super dramatic at times, but the balance isn't quite there, I'm afraid. Also, bit weird that it just doesn't use the Wii's controls for anything significant. I mean, it's right there. The other slice of easy bread in our Radiant Dawn sandwich belongs to Fire Emblem Fate's Birthright, which is a much better time than whatever the fuck Revelation was trying to do. Birthright can best be described as the typically good route, or at least like the morally cleaner way of experiencing this game, since Hoshido is Corrin's birth family and in general just a lot less evil. With plenty of grinding opportunities, there's every chance that you become overpowered and the game balance is thrown straight out the window, but it is, again, a very approachable Fire Emblem game, and that will never be a bad thing. Imagine if you just never wanted to play a game because it was too hard. The main problem with Fire Emblem Warriors is that it's more Warriors than Fire Emblem. It feels roughly like it belongs in the same franchise as all those tactical games, but obviously all the action kind of detracts a bit from the slower pacing of mainline games, and honestly, all the crossover stuff has me completely disinterested in the story. This is fixed superbly by Fire Emblem Warriors 3 Hopes, and I'm as shocked as anyone that I liked this game so much. The Fire Emblem DNA is here and is used really well, but 3 Hopes takes a stab at reimagining the events of 3 Houses and actually does a really good job of it. Franchise purists will have a hard time here, but for everyone else, it's superbly done. Conquest was my first experience of playing Fire Emblem Fates, and I tell you what, I picked right first time. The main differences here are that you're on the shadier side of the story, where your found family are secretly evil, but also not really, which kind of tells you everything you need to know about the story's execution. It's a little bit all over the place. Thankfully, there's no grinding allowed in Conquest, so instead you've got a selection of brilliantly designed maps to work through in what is one of the most satisfyingly challenging games in the series. It really shows off what Fire Emblem can be when you are forced to play it tactically and make good use of passive abilities and proper positioning. Yes, it's very hard, but it's not asking for anything too crazy to get to the end. At least until you start messing around with Lunatic, but at that point you have poked the bear. In being the first Fire Emblem game unleashed on the Western world, the Blazing Blade had the impossible task of convincing Westerners that this strange tactical RPG was worth sinking some time into. And I think Nintendo would have been facing an uphill battle if this game wasn't so good. It doesn't do anything exceptionally well or anything, but everything is like at least a 7 or 8 out of 10. Having Lyn, Eliwood, and Hector being your main characters is a bit like cheating because they're all wonderful at their jobs. But even then you've got brilliantly paced maps and a sort of middle-of-the-road approach to difficulty. It doesn't hold your hand, but it also won't put a knife through it either. Somehow, after more than 20 years, it's still that incredibly consistent rock of a video game. What is the secret? Can't say I ever expected Fire Emblem Gaiden to get a remake, but it is a game that needed one. Although maybe not a game as good as Shadows of Valentia. I think the best thing I can say about this game is it manages to do a bit of everything. It's got the intense gameplay refinement that characterizes modern Fire Emblem, with updated graphics and audio and beautiful orchestral music, and we've still got some of the quirkier parts of Gaiden poking through, like the dungeon crawling. It's an effective remake that brings Gaiden into the modern day with small tweaks, but also some more major changes that turns Gaiden's bare-bones story into something tragic and kind of emotional. More remakes, please, you know you've got more to do. I don't know what Intelligent Systems thought they were doing in 1996, but I can't imagine that they thought they were making a Fire Emblem game so insanely good that we'd still be looking back on it in awe 30 years later. Genealogy of the Holy War is so out of character for Fire Emblem in the 90s, since this franchise was still finding its identity and didn't seem capable of something like this. You have a story that spans 2 generations and contains potentially the darkest, most shocking plot twist in the series, and you can feel the ambition trying so hard to burst out of every scene. Deeply memorable, and yes, remake please, for the love of God, yes. It wouldn't even be that hard to do. Half of these features are still kicking around all these years later. It's goddamn iconic. Do you remember that game that felt like Fire Emblem mixed with Persona? Yeah, that's kind of what 3 Houses feels like, and it's not necessarily because of flashy combat, but this is the social man's Fire Emblem game. Where yes, you have your major decision that shapes the entire trajectory of the story and can influence a lot of replay value, but 3 Houses is big on character. There are many of them, and they're not all amazing, but most of them are. And if you can leave the monastery long enough to sometimes progress the plot, you've got one of the absolute strongest Fire Emblem games ever made. It needs to get in the gym so it can shed some of this emotional weight. Like Lazarus in his prime, Fire Emblem Awakening looked the Grim Reaper square in his face and said, "I ain't done yet, put the scythe away." A lot of the best games in this video, it's nice that they are as good as they are. With Awakening, it had to be good, since Fire Emblem was circling the toilet bowl at this time and was badly in need of a savior. Awakening may have its detractors, but this blend of tight tactical combat with a humongous emphasis on cultivating relationships between characters and getting them to pump out a second generation of units to play as, yeah, it worked on a lot of people. Lucina isn't my favourite character in the world, but I like how she fits in a story that does have a lot going on in it. Also, Lunatic Plus made me hear colours, so points for the trauma, I guess. Quite simply, Path of Radiance is what Fire Emblem should always strive to be. Awakening may be the mainstream revival that the franchise needed to stay afloat, and Path of Radiance might not be as anime, but it is just a stunningly presented video game. The cast of characters are incredibly well written, the world building is tippy top tier, and it's all crammed into a story about warring nations and race relations. Ike is such a great protagonist who starts off a smaller part of a larger world but rises to the occasion so perfectly. This is elevated Fire Emblem at its finest, and it's not just the best game in the franchise, it's one of the best strategy RPGs ever made, and if you've got the coin, it's worth tracking down. It'll also be on the Switch too one day, so maybe wait for that instead. It's what Ike would want.